When I walked into his hospital room, he was on the floor. The year was 1994, and I had received a call from a hospital asking me to come and anoint a 24-year-old man who was in the last stage of his battle with AIDS. Now, this was the early 1990s, when there was still so much that we did not know about that disease, and there was still so much fear about that disease. Apparently, this young man's family had disowned him 2 years prior when he told them the truth that he had fallen in love with another man, that they had been in a relationship since they were in college, and now he had contracted HIV/AIDS. The family had not come to visit him for 2 years. When I got to the hospital, I had a room number written down, but I couldn't find it. I walked around the floor, kept looking at different signs on the wall, but I couldn't find this young man's room. And finally, someone told me that he was down at the end of a long hallway, a hallway where there were no other patients being cared for. It was a hallway of empty rooms, except for his room at the end of the hallway. And when I finally got to that room and walked in, I found this young man on the floor. His bed linens were soiled. Clearly, he had not been washed or cared for or even looked in upon for hours. I rang the little button to call the nurse's station. Nobody answered. I rang the button again. No one came. I got angry, and I stormed up the hallway, irate at what was going on here. And I got to the nurse's station, and in a clearly non-professional voice, I exclaimed to anybody who would listen, "Why is that young man hidden down at the end of that hallway? And how long has he been on the floor? And when was the last time that any of you checked in on him to see if he was okay?" At first, everybody just looked at me. And then one hospital employee barked back at me and said, "Look here, Reverend. That boy at the end of the hallway is sick, and that sickness is his own fault because he is a pervert. And I'm not going to touch him because I don't want to get sick too." And then this hospital employee said to me, "So, Reverend, if you love him so much, why don't you go and clean him up?" Well, it rarely happens, but in that moment, I was speechless. A medical professional, a hospital employee, talking about a patient that way. Disease is a terrible thing. Illness invades our body and takes our control away. Being sick stinks. And it strikes me that there is more to our suffering when we're sick. There's more to our suffering than just the physical reality of our illness. Sometimes sickness makes us feel isolated, alone. It's awful when our illness makes us feel untouchable. It's awful when a physical illness makes us feel cut off, abandoned, at the end of the hallway, utterly alone. In the Bible, we hear about an illness that resulted in isolation for those who were suffering, and that illness was leprosy. That term, leprosy, is used in the Bible to describe a whole collection of skin diseases. And during the time of the Old Testament and the New Testament, people did not know where these diseases came from. They didn't know how to prevent them or how to treat them. The worst forms of leprosy resulted in terrible physical malformation and ultimately death. So, everyone in the Bible was afraid of leprosy. So, in the Bible, people who showed up with signs of these diseases were required to leave their homes, leave their families and their loved ones. They were required to live at the edge of the village or out in the wilderness. They were forbidden to touch other people, forbidden to get close to anybody. And if someone drew near to the leper was required to shout out, "Unclean, unclean," so that the healthy person would know to stay away. Even the religious laws of the Old Testament required lepers to remain isolated. Their physical suffering was compounded by rejection and isolation and loneliness. Now you may be asking, why am I talking about leprosy today? Well, because in this session we are learning about a saint who lived with leprosy. And she lived with the isolation which came with it. And no, she didn't live in the era of the Old Testament or the New Testament. She was actually born in the year 1220. The place was a small town near Brussels. A local family was rejoicing in the birth of their daughter, whose name was Alice. By all accounts, Alice was a bright, inquisitive, pretty girl whose personality seemed to make everybody smile when they met her. But young Alice also dealt with a number of health problems, and while she was still very young, probably around the age of 7 or 8, she was entrusted to a local convent of Cistercian nuns where she would live and study and be cared for. In her late teens, she freely chose to remain in that community and formally became a nun. Her personality, the gifts of her personality, were a wonderful addition to the Abbey community, and the other sisters in the community loved Alice. Which is why it was so hard when, one day, Alice developed a strange skin disease. At first, no one knew what it was. But then a special doctor recognized what was happening. This was leprosy. Historians tell us that leprosy was extremely rare in Europe until the European troops returned home after they went to the Holy Land to fight the Crusades. And when those troops came back to Europe, they brought a new disease with them: leprosy. No one knew how it was spread. No one knew what caused it. No one knew how to treat it or cure it. The only thing they knew to do was to confine the person, to isolate the person. In isolation, they would either get better or they would die. But at least no one else would get sick. So, young Alice was told that she needed to go into isolation, isolated from the sisters whom she loved. The abbess arranged for Alice to live in a little hut on the edge of the Abbey property. She would stay there, all alone, all week. The only time the other sisters would see her was at Sunday Mass, when Alice would come forward after everyone else had done so to receive the Eucharist. And unlike the rest of the community, which received Holy Communion in the form of the consecrated host and the precious blood in the chalice, Alice was limited to receiving communion only in the form of the host. And she wept over the fact that she could not be nourished by the blood of Christ. There were many tears on that day in the year 1240 when Alice had to leave the convent building and walk to her isolation hut. The other sisters would miss her. She would miss the sisters. And now she was all alone, sick, suffering, and isolated. And she was afraid. There had always been people who suggested that serious illnesses, like leprosy, were a punishment from God. We see that again and again in the Bible. People assumed that lepers had committed some kind of horrible sin, and God was punishing them for their perversions. Jesus rejects that kind of thinking. But even in the time of Alice, there were still people who whispered that the sick nun from the Cistercian monastery was being punished for her sins. That's why she was sick. But Alice and her sisters in the community knew better. Now, Alice did not know why or how she was sick. She could not control what was happening to her physically, but she could control how she chose to respond to what was happening to her. Now, remember, she was only 20 years old when she contracted leprosy and went into isolation. And at first, she understandably wept and worried. But she did not blame God for her illness. Instead, she began to pray, and she asked God, "What do you want me to learn from this experience? How are you going to help me through this experience?" And slowly, she became convinced that her isolation could become an opportunity to spend uninterrupted time focused on the Lord, an opportunity for her to be focused completely on Christ. She knew that Christ loved her, and she was falling in love with him. And she also remembered that when a man and woman fall in love, well, they love to spend time together, alone, without distraction. This, Alice believed, was what God could do for her during her time of isolation. She believed that her life on the outskirts of the Abbey property was a daily opportunity to spend time with the Lord whom she loved. And as her body became weaker, she prayed about the physical sufferings that Christ experienced on the cross. And that led her to pray for the people who came to the Abbey, asking the sisters to pray for them. In other words, as she experienced weakness in her own body, she prayed for everyone who was sick or suffering. She prayed for the souls of those who had died. She prayed for everyone who felt abandoned and alone. Eventually, Alice lost her sight and was paralyzed. So she is often invoked as a patron saint for people who are blind or people who experience paralysis. She died at the age of 30 in the year 1250. That's well over 750 years ago. So why are we remembering this saint from a little town near Brussels who lived so long ago. Well, it is true, she lived a long time ago. But doesn't her story sound strangely contemporary? Let's see. She lived at a time when a strange, foreign illness had arrived on her continent. And the best medical authorities really were not sure how the disease was spread or how to prevent it. It made many people sick and killed many more. The only thing the experts could agree on was this: the best way to handle this disease was isolation. Doesn't that sound familiar? Doesn't it sound like today? Many of us have felt isolated over the past 15 months. The COVID virus came along and forced almost everyone into isolation of one kind or another. We have been isolated and disconnected from loved ones. There's been so much uncertainty, so much fear, so many people blaming others for what was happening, people getting sick, people dying, so much we could not control and still can't control. But what did Saint Alice do in the midst of her suffering and her isolation with that strange disease? Well, she prayed about basic questions. What does God want me to learn through this experience? How does God help us through this kind of experience? Alice was convinced that even in her isolation, the risen Lord was close to her, and the risen Lord wanted to draw her even closer to himself. Over the past 15 months, many parishioners have told me that the COVID isolation they've been through gave them a new opportunity to pray, to ponder, to read, to reflect. Many parishioners saw in subtle ways how they were drawing closer to Christ, even as they had to keep other people at arm's length. In other words, at a time when some people were responding to a crisis with fear and accusation, some souls realized that this was an opportunity to draw closer to Christ, to pray more often to Christ, to listen more carefully to Christ. And as they did, those same souls realized that their own struggles and suffering could make them more compassionate to the people around them who are struggling and feeling abandoned. And even now, in these days when it appears that the COVID crisis is ending, these lessons still apply. St. Alice still has much to teach us, because even today, people who are sick are often made to feel isolated, rejected, judged, and down at the end of the hall. Not only in a hospital where a young man with AIDS is left on the floor. Sometimes people with mental illness feel isolated because their family and friends just don't know what to do or how to help them. Sometimes people with a variety of physical ailments feel abandoned by family members who are frightened, or by a healthcare system which is often controlled by profit margins and the bottom line. People still get blamed for their own sickness. People still feel rejected, left alone to suffer. It is then that we, God's people, are called to remember what we've learned in our own struggles, so that we can carry God's compassion and love to the end of every hallway and to the doorway of every home and hut. St. Alice knew that Christ was always with her. May we bring her message to every person who believes that no one cares. Saint Alice, pray for us.